Welcome to an episode of Palmer Village's Palmer Voices, a personal story project preserving artifacts and diverse personal accounts of life in the villages of Palmer. Stories of ordinary people are extraordinary. The history, the stories, and the artifacts from each village over the decades are what make Palmer unique. Brought to you by the Palmer Public Library, MPAC TV, and other local organizations. Funded in part by grants from the Leo S. Walsh Foundation and the Palmer Cultural Council, a local agency, supported by the Mass Cultural Council, a state agency. We hope you enjoy this Palmer story.
Hello, my name is Denise Fontaine-Pincince, and I was born in Three Rivers, Massachusetts. I was born in 1953, and I lived on Pine Street and spent most of my life in either Three Rivers or one of the villages of Palmer. I was interested in family history and genealogy from the time that I could speak, and I was very fortunate to live right across the street from my dad's parents and my dad's maternal grandmother. So I had three grandparents living across the street where I could just cross right over to their home anytime I wanted to talk about family history, and I did. So today, what I'd like to share with you is some of the history of my family while also sharing history of Palmer and all of its villages. In 2018, I decided it was time to share my stories with my family, my immediate family and my extended family. And fortunately for all of those relatives, because I had information on the Fontaine family and I had information on the Dulude family, I incorporated most of what I know, or at least a lot of what I know, into a book. It's called My People, Family Stories and Poems, Preserving Our French-Canadian History. And a copy of this book is actually available for your enjoyment at any time you'd like. It can be looked at the Palmer Library in the History Room. And I do believe that the pages have been scanned and those are available to enjoy at home as well. I'm not going to read this book word for word. I'm going to sort of review it, and I'm going to hit upon a few high points and highlights of stories that I particularly enjoy that were shared with me of times gone by that I think would have an impact on especially younger people today who had no idea that there was a time we didn't have refrigeration. We only had ice boxes. And I grew up in a family who harvested ice to deliver ice to lots of families in Palmer. So I'll get to that very shortly. I'm going to start by introducing you to my grandfather, Roland Fontaine. His name was Roland Joseph, and people called him RJ. He was a rather industrious man, and he continued to be a Canadian citizen till the day he died. He never went for his citizenship. Very hardworking man. Came here, he was born in 1905 in Fontaine and Dulude, Canada, and in the province of Quebec. And he came to America with his family to visit relatives when he was around 14 years old. They were considering moving to Three Rivers, and they were looking for work. Things were pretty poor on the farm in Fontaine and Dulude. And they came here, and they stayed for a very short time and decided to go back home. Well, that was a short-lived time for him because he was working in the asbestos mines, the Tedford mines in Canada, which the effects of that plagued him for the rest of his life, plagued his lungs. You wouldn't have known it to see what a hard worker he was, but that's eventually what did him in. But 2 years later, when he was about 16 years old, he traveled back to the United States with his older sister, Angelina. They were 2 of 6 children in the family. They took the train. They came to visit a relative of their mom's in Three Rivers. And they started looking for work. They were determined. The family was determined they were going to move here. And it took them a few weeks, and they weren't coming up with work. And they were getting very close to the point where they were going to head back home. And their family back home, because they hadn't heard from them in a few weeks, decided, well, this must be good news. So they packed up and headed to Three Rivers. I have a poem that I wrote where I pretend that 2 letters were exchanged in the mail. They're written in French. And that was kind of the way it was back then. They weren't calling people on the phone to say, hey, did you find a job? No, I didn't. So the whole family came here to Massachusetts and settled in Three Rivers, Mass. RJ was very industrious because his family in Canada had so many lumberjacks that was work that he was familiar with. And in fact, his dad, George Fontaine Sr., had 2 brothers who at one point in Canada had headed for the woods to cut trees, and they were never heard from again. So that's all I know about those 2 great uncles of mine. But RJ started to cut wood in Stafford Springs, Connecticut. And when he and my grandmother were married in 1925, he was actually cutting wood in Stafford Springs, and she was the only woman in the lumber camp. And she was washing laundry for people. And they spent their first Christmas alone in Stafford Springs at the lumber camp because everybody else took a train a day earlier to go visit their families. And my grandparents, RJ and Beatrice Dulude Fontaine, decided to take the train Christmas morning. Well, they walked to the train tracks and waited a very long time and apparently missed the train because the train never came. And when my grandfather shared that story with me, I could tell it was a very sad memory for them. They had a very lonely, quiet Christmas in Stafford at the lumber camp. So there's a lot to tell. I'm going to touch upon that, but I'm going to back up for a minute. I have a poem here about RJ when he was 9 years old. When you're the oldest boy in a family of 6 children on a farm and money is tight, you get sent to work. He loved the farm. He loved it so much that later in life, he ended up having a farm to raise Black Angus cows as pets, again, in the town of Three Rivers. But I'll get to that in a moment. But when he was 9 years old, he had to walk a mile to a little cottage industry where he was making shoelaces by hand. And I'll share a poem with you about that experience right now. And I wrote this poem when one of his great-great-grandchildren happened to be learning to tie their shoes. The poem is called Metal Aglets, Cotton Cording, and a Little Bit of Spit. He doesn't know, as he learns to tie his shoes, that nearly a century ago, in the town of Fontainebleau, his great-great-grandfather, at the age of 9, walked 2 miles each way to make shoelaces for 5 cents a day. True story. Imagine 5 cents a day. That was his contradiction. Later in life, my grandfather's brother, Maurice, he had 2 brothers, George and Maurice. Maurice told me how much he resented that his older brother always had the opportunity to leave the farm, to go and earn money off the farm. And he always wished that he could, but he was given farm chores with his other siblings, and there was RJ, who would go off to earn money for the family. And my grandfather would have loved to have stayed on the farm. That was his passion. And so he wished that he could have helped with the farming. So it just goes to show how placement in family determines a lot. At least back in those days, it certainly did. I'm also going to read a poem where I think that this story illustrates just how poor some times were at the beginning of my grandfather's life in Canada. He told the story of how they had 1 pair of boots in the winter that he had to share with his siblings. And if they wanted to go out in the snow, they had to take turns using that pair of boots. So I wrote this poem knowing that in America, growing up in the 50s and 60s and living the life that I've lived, we've had so much wealth and so much opportunity for us in this beautiful town of Palmer, lots of job opportunity and possessions and homes and churches. This inspired this poem. It's called Threadbare. At last inventory, I had 19 pair, not counting the Technicas now retired with treads so bare they aren't trusted anymore. sitting next to the limbers with their tire chain traction and less than 100 miles under their soles. The sorels are worn mostly for snowshoeing, and the neos slip over the sorels for really cold winter walks. And the ski boots, oh, the ski boots, that have danced across summits in the Rockies, Appalachians, and High Sierras. There are the water shoes, the surf booties, and flip-flops to wear in the shower at campgrounds, 3 pairs of white sneakers, and the sweet pink sandals worn only once. Pepe grew up on a farm over the border, second oldest child in a family of 6, with 1 pair of boots to share. Alone, he went out in the snow. The others watched from the window, waiting their turn. Well, things turned around for him. Came to America, went to work as a lumberjack. He had met my grandmother when he first came to America at the age of 14, Beatrice Dulude. She had been born in the States, but from a French-Canadian family, spoke French, went to St. Anne's School, as we all did. And there was a St. Anne's Parish where we all went to church. Most of the French-speaking families in Three Rivers went to St. Anne's School, and most of the Polish families in Three Rivers went to St. Peter and Paul. When my grandfather came back to the States the second time, he started to court my grandmother. And we have a letter. He was cutting wood in Stafford Springs. We have a letter. It's very old, 1928. And he wrote it to, 1923. He wrote this to my grandmother in French from the lumber camp. And it basically lets her know that he wants her to be his girl. And my dad always said this was the most important thing that the family owned. It's very, very sweet. The translation of this letter is in my book. If anyone is interested, I'm not going to spoil it now for you and read it in this video, but you're very, very welcome to go and read the book and look at the translation. It's a gorgeous love letter from a man who couldn't write in English and who never went to school. A very brilliant person who could build anything, fix anything, do anything, like so many immigrants, so many hardworking people in their day. So Pepe came to America, started cutting wood, ultimately decided he wanted to be in Three Rivers more. His wife certainly wanted to be, my grandmother. She missed her family. So he decided that he was going to start a business. And it just so happens that in the late 20s, there was someone who delivered ice. He was an iceman, and he had a real misfortune. When he was harvesting ice on a pond in Palmer, his horses, they would drag their big cutters over the ice to cut the big blocks of ice, and his horses fell through the ice. And obviously very upsetting to him, and he gave up the ice business from that mishap. Well, that mishap for him was an opportunity for my grandfather, and he saw the opportunity to open a business called Fontaine Ice, R.J. Fontaine Ice. I have his ice pick here and his sheath, which you can see he would wear on his belt. And he started to deliver ice. And my dad, who was born in 1931, at the age of 12, 13, started to deliver ice with his dad. This is all in my book. Probably the happiest time in my father's life, honestly. His stories about this business were just incredible. As an iceman, for people who don't know what this means, again, there was a time when refrigeration didn't exist. That didn't come into being till the late 40s. And people depended on these ice boxes that they had, sometimes in their kitchens, sometimes on their porches. And the iceman would come, and you would leave this card in your window every week. You would let them know whichever number is sticking up on the top in the window on this card would let the iceman know how many pounds of ice you wanted left in your ice box that week. So my dad and his dad would go around Three Rivers Spring Water Ice, R.J. Fontaine, it's spelled correctly here as Fontaine, but incorrectly here. A lot of people try to pronounce our name Fontaine and put a U in it. So this ice pick has a U in it. And the telephone number to call them, 683. It's pretty awesome. Anyway, this was one of his tools, along with ice tongs and ice picks, and obviously a truck that had a canvas top that you would lift up so that your ice wasn't directly in the hot sun in the summertime. They'd get to someone's home, they'd look at how many pounds of ice the person wants, and most of their customers invited them to come right into their kitchen. You didn't have to knock, you just went right in. And they'd open the ice box, they would remove whatever meat was on the ice, take it out, take the little piece of ice that might still be in the ice box, take it out, put the new piece in, take the little tiny piece, put it on top, put the meat on. My dad told me that most homes were meticulously clean. He said some were really difficult to serve because some people would actually put like loose hamburger sitting right on their ice. He said there was everything going on. He saw every kind of customer, and it was an interesting job. He loved it. There was a family in Cheneyville that had a mother and daughter sharing a duplex, and it was one of his favorite places to deliver ice because the daughter loved to bake, and she had a little daughter that he said had flaxen hair. The little daughter would always run out to the ice truck to meet him, and he would chisel off a little piece of ice for her to suck on, and he'd pick her up with one arm, and he'd pick up 50 pounds of ice with his tongs in the other arm, and he would carry her up to the house. And then the mother, who loved to bake, but no one liked baked goods in their family, always left my dad a wonderful baked treat on top of the ice box. So he said that was one of his favorite deliveries. It was really a pleasure. He also, they talked about, at one point, I asked my dad the question, when did Pepe start the ice business? So I was always asking questions about this. I have a kind of a funny poem to read you about that. My father had a great sense of humor. You ask him a question, he's not going to directly answer it. He's going to make you figure it out, and if he can get you to use math in that equation, he'll do that for you. So here's my poem about my asking my dad, when did Pepe start the ice business? R.J. Fontaine Ice. When I asked, what year did Pepe start the ice business? My dad folded his arms, stared at the corner of the kitchen ceiling, pressed his tongue behind his upper dentures, the way he always does when working figures in his head, and said, let's see. In 1945, the old lady from Cheneyville gave me a bag of pears, and when I brought them home, my father said, son of a bee, I've delivered ice to that woman for 17 years, and not once did she give me any pears. So I always had to do math, and it was a life of riddles, but it served me well. And I have a poem in this book about the duplex delivery. I have poems about all kinds of things. I have a poem in this book about my grandfather buying all of his ice tools from the gentleman who sold it, Mr. Giza. And so I wrote that poem as though that there were separate Palmer Journal Register articles. One was announcing this mishap of these horses falling into the pond. The other one was a classified ad with all the ice tools for sale, listed by the gentleman who was giving it up. And then the third one was an ad in the Palmer Journal by my grandfather advertising his ice business. So that was a way that I was trying to tell the story of how did this happen? How do people go into these businesses? What inspires people to do this? I also have a prose poem here about, I use a little poetic liberty. When the refrigeration came to being, this was the end of the ice business for my grandfather. He certainly wasn't going to be peddling ice anymore if people didn't have ice boxes. So he was an industrious man. He decided to start an oil company. People were starting to heat their homes with oil. So he set up business, started to deliver oil, and discovered pretty early on that he was allergic to the fumes of oil, which certainly explains a lot for me because I have so many of the same sensitivities. I always tell people, if you want to know more about yourself, listen to family stories and get to know the people who came before you, because quite likely you've inherited a lot more from these people than you think you have. So long story short, RJ sold his oil business to his brother-in-law, Alphonse Dulude, his wife Beatrice's brother. Many people in Palmer, I'm sure, bought their oil from Dulude Oil for many, many, many years before Noonan Oil bought that business from Leroy Rogers, who took it over from his father-in-law when he passed away. So Dulude Oil came into existence that way, but at that point, my grandfather decided he needed to start another business, and that's when he started Fontaine Moving and Storage. But I want to back up for a minute, and I want to play a little pretend game with all of you. So I imagined a few local people. My mom was a member of the Ladies of St. Anne's in Three Rivers. She had a lot of friends there, so I was familiar with all kinds of families in Three Rivers. And so I took a few last names of people from the town, and I took poetic liberty, and I pretended that there were two women walking on the street talking about wanting to buy a refrigerator because the ice business was going by and ice men were starting to close their doors, and the writing was on the wall. It was time now for us to think about having a refrigerator. So the title of this poem is called Obituary. When he said, "That icebox has served us well for 34 years. Give me one good reason why we should get rid of it," I said, "Because every single family in this neighborhood, including the Gondeks and the Waluleks, has a refrigerator, and I heard Lou Jarvis telling Millie Galunka that Fontaine Ice is closing, and that will mean buying from Labonte and paying extra for delivery, and who knows how much longer they'll be in business." That's when he sighed that long, silent sigh, where he tosses a hard glance over his left side and said, "On Saturday, I'll stop by the Montgomery Ward." And then I said, "I already did." So that's probably the kind of conversation that people had in their families because they knew time was up. We were going to buy a refrigerator, and we were going to plug this refrigerator in, and that was the end of the ice business. So I'm going to back up again a little bit. I'm going to go to Fontaine Moving and Storage. I have a picture in here in the book. I have a large picture of my grandfather, late 40s, with his moving truck, his first moving van. This was a flatbed truck that he bought, and his brother Maurice welded metal and built the cab for him so that he could start this business. They painted it together, had lettering put on, and he was in business. I heard a lot of stories about the moving business because I grew up in the moving business. The warehouse at the end of Pine Street in Three Rivers, the office buildings, this was my life. Fontaine Moving and Storage. My brother worked there. I cleaned the offices. I packed homes in the summer when I was in college. We all knew about moving people. So it was an interesting time and an interesting business. And I appreciate seeing a family member, an ancestor who modeled being resourceful. When one door closes, another one opens, and you move on. And this entrepreneurship also served me well as I started my own businesses. I didn't mention my father's name. My father was Richard Fontaine. He was an only child. There's an interesting story about the fact that he was an only child. I have a photo here also in the book. This was taken somewhere around 1930 or 1931. It's a Fontaine family photo, And my grandmother is here, and she is pregnant, expecting my father. So this was taken late 1930 or early 1931, as my dad was born on Valentine's Day, 1931. And I won't read the poem, but there is a poem here about the father penguin who guards the egg while the mother goes off to look for food and to do her thing while dad is guarding the eggs. And the poem includes the story of the little Matryoshka doll, where you find a doll inside of a doll inside of a doll, because my grandmother had already had a couple of miscarriages, and the doctor of the day told them that if she was going to carry full term, she needed to not be walking around. She needed to stay off her feet. So my grandfather, they lived on Charles Street in an apartment building at that time. And my grandfather would carry my grandmother down the stairs. They lived on the second floor of an apartment building, cross the street to her aunt's house, Philomene Dulude, her father's sister's house. She was actually now a Bernard. Philomene Dulude married Narcisse Bernard. They had 13 children. And my grandmother was very close to her cousins and her aunt and uncle. And she would go and stay with her aunt all day while my grandfather was working. And then at the end of the workday, he would come and get her. He'd carry her across the street, up the stairs. So I felt like that story was worthy of mentioning. People didn't have the facility that they have today. They didn't have the resources. They didn't have the hospitalization, the kind of care, the medical care that they had. But they did what they had to do, and my father was born a healthy baby, and he was the only baby born to them. I'm going to jump into the Dulude side of the family for a little bit, because they are also from Quebec, and that is my dad's mother's side of the family. His grandmother, Georgiana Olivier Dulude, lived with my grandparents, Beatrice and R.J. Fontaine, for all of my lifetime until she passed in the 80s, and for most of my father's lifetime. And she was married to Alphonse Dulude Sr. And even though he was alive for a good part of my dad's growing up years, they didn't live in the same household. He had a drinking problem, and according to my dad, when he was sober, he was the salt of the earth. He was a hardworking man. He was a drayman for many, many years in town. And for those of you who don't know what that means, he drove a horse and buggy, a wagon, and he would pick up goods for people and make deliveries. So the town knew him, and he was a great guy and a hard worker. But when he drank, he was not a nice man. So there reached a point in time that my great-grandmother, Georgiana, went to live with her daughter and son-in-law. So there she was. There's a lot about her family that she shared stories of with me. She was really the person I consider the great storyteller. I would go across the street. All of her photos were in the bottom drawer of her dresser on the first floor of my grandparents' house. I would walk in. I'd say, "Is Big Meme here?" We called her Big Meme because when we were all really young, all of her great-grandchildren, and there were two Memes living in that house. There was Petite Meme, which was the younger grandmother, my grandmother, and there was Grosse Meme, which was the older great-grandmother. So in time, as we all got older and older, we shortened Petite Meme to Tit Meme, and then it became Meme, and Grosse Meme became Big Meme. So if you hear me talking about that and you read this in the book, I do explain it there as well. But Big Meme was always there, and I would walk in at any time with both grandmothers, and they were always available. That's the kind of grandparents they were. And I love to take the pictures out, and I love to hear the stories about the Duludes and about her mother's side of the family, Melvina LaFond. I have a lot to share with you about a very interesting gentleman, my great-grandmother's grandfather. But before we get to that, so when I would go across the street, I started listening to these stories and looking at these photographs at a very young age. And somewhere around 4th or 5th grade, I asked my great-grandmother if we could start writing this down together. So she said, sure. So here is my handwriting, which is impeccable. I must have taken cursive at St. Anne's School. And clearly, I had great handwriting. And we numbered all of her photographs. Now, today, I'm a little sorry that what we had on hand was a black magic marker, and I put the numbers, she and I put the numbers right on the old photos. I regret that somewhat, and yet that's what we had on hand. That's what we did. I was a kid. I've had to forgive myself. But all of these old photos that we recorded, which was fabulous, have these numbers written on them. And that's the story of that. But that allowed me through the years to remember what my grandmother told me and to know who was who. And there were a lot of people to keep track of. So Big Mame would tell me about all kinds of people. And she had a set of grandparents on her mother's side, the LaFons, who she would stop and visit on Arnold Street in Palmer, she said, when she would be walking home from school. She was born in Quaticook. Big Mame Georgiana was born in Quaticook, Canada on October 1st, 1885. But she came to America when she was 9 months old. And when her father, Joseph Livier, and mother, when they came to America when she was 9 months old, she was the eldest child, they changed their name. Many, many families found that it was easier to change their names if they thought it would be too difficult for people to spell and say something like Livier. So her father changed his name to Smart. And so from that point forward, he was known as Joseph Smart. Some of his siblings did not do that. Some of them maintained the Livier name. This gets complicated in families when cousins have different last names, but that's the way it is all across America. This is our melting pot country and our melting pot towns and communities. But let's go back to Georgie's. My dad always called his grandmother Georgie. Let's go back to her parents and grandparents. So her grandmother and grandfather, Michael and Mary LaFond, her mother's parents, were quite an interesting couple. Mike LaFond, who would be my great-great-great-grandfather, had one arm missing, and on the other arm, he had that hand missing. So he had one arm for most of his adult life. He was the father of 5 children. He was an avid gardener. He had horses. They lived on Arnold Street in Palmer. I have pictures of that house also in the book. And Michael had a terrible accident occur. He was working at the sawmill in Palmer at one time, perfectly healthy man, family, wife. And the accident occurred where, as he went to place a tree into a large saw, he got caught up, and one hand started to be sucked in through the saw. So he took the other hand to try to remove himself, and consequently, one arm was removed and the other hand was removed. As if that wasn't sad enough and difficult enough, he was working that day at the sawmill with only one other gentleman. And that man became so frightened that he literally ran away. He ran off. He didn't stay to help him. So Michael was quite a distance from downtown Palmer, and he walked himself to the doctor in Palmer, where his life was saved. He was stitched up, and he spent the rest of the days. I have a beautiful tin type photo of Mike LaFond here, and I have a beautiful photo of him with his wife. I have his obituary. This is a rather ragged photo of an obituary that my great-grandmother had in her bottom drawer, and another shot of him right here. He lived to a ripe old age, and if you check out this book and look at the photo, he's holding a hoe under that one arm. He lived a very productive life, and he made the most of his situation. He had a very, very hard life. It wasn't just about the accident. When he was 3, he was orphaned. went to live with an uncle who was abusive to him, and at a very, very early age left home and was on his own. So life wasn't easy for this man, but my great-grandmother spoke very highly of this couple and her grandparents and talked about them a lot to me, and I really appreciated it. I have a pair of earrings here in this little assemblage box. This handkerchief came from her grandmother Mary, and this pair of earrings were hers. I have a few other little artifacts that I'll share right now. This is in the book as well. There are 2 locks of hair here that belong to my great-grandmother's younger brother, Homer. When he was 7, he had 7 locks like this all around his head. And his dad really didn't like that he had this curly long hair. So at 7 years old, the locks were cut off, and their mom cried a lot over it and kept the locks, and my great-grandmother hung on to them. I have a pin from the Franco-American Club in Three Rivers, which most French men belong to. And I have a couple of other little pieces of jewelry that belong to my great-grandmother. So this photo with all the details is in this book as well. Let's see. Mike LaFond. I think I've covered what I can cover for Mike LaFond. I'd like to share the story of a ring with you today. This is a really lovely little green velveteen box with a mother of pearl button. The clasp still works very, very well. It was bought prior to 1925 from E.S. Brooks Jewelers in Palmer, Mass. It's engraved in the inside. E.S. Brooks Jewelers existed for a long time because when I was in high school, I worked for Charkutian Drugstore on Main Street in Palmer, and E.S. Brooks was right next door. And so I can tell you that way into the 70s, that jewelry store was there. But this ring is pretty special to me because living across the street, as I said, I went and visited with my grandparents a lot. I have a brother and sister. My older brother is Bernie Fontaine, and my sister is Michelle Fontaine, known as Mike to lots of the family members. And we all have memories of growing up across the street from family, and we all had our own special things that we did when we went across the street. I was the photo person and the story person, and my sister loved to play cards. And I don't know, maybe my brother liked to go over for orange soda and for other things. He got to help my Pepe with haying every summer to feed the Black Angus cows, which I haven't addressed yet. So he had other roles in the family. We all had a unique relationship with our grandparents and our great-grandmother, but they were all terrific. So one day I was chatting with my grandmother, and as we were talking, I commented on her plain gold wedding band. And she never wore any jewelry. She was very, very plain, very clean, very simple, amazing woman. And she said to me very casually, "I have a diamond ring." And I said, "You do? Where is it?" And she pointed upstairs, and she said, "Oh, it's up in my bedroom." And I said, "Why don't you wear it?" And she said something in French to me, and I said, "What does that mean?" And she said, "It means," and she whispered, "My hands are always in SHIT." That's what the French translated to. Because she raised chickens for many, many, many years to help support their family in the 40s while Pepe was delivering ice and doing other things to raise money. And she liked to keep their house very clean. And I'm sure for her, this ring was way too special to be wearing just every day. So when my grandmother passed away, and my father being an only child, my grandparents both passed away. My father was an only child, and my parents asked each of us if there was anything special that we'd like to have. And I said, yes, I would really like to have Meme's diamond ring. And both my dad and my mom said, Meme didn't have a diamond ring. And I said, yeah, she did. She told me that she had one, that Pepe bought it for her before they were married. So my mother immediately went to my great aunt Lil, my grandfather's sister, Lillian Fontaine-Pincince, who was still alive, and she said, "Did Beatrice have a diamond ring?" And Lillian said, "Oh, yes. I helped Rollin," she called him Rollin, her brother, instead of RJ. "I helped Rollin pick it out." So she told my mother all about it. So when my parents cleaned the house out very carefully, my mother was looking everywhere for this diamond ring that she still didn't believe existed. And she found it. She came across this ring. She brought it to Aunt Lil. She said, "Is this the ring?" "Yes, it is." She had it cleaned. My parents came to see me, and they said, "You were right. Meme did have a diamond ring. I don't want you to be too disappointed." But my mother was very tiny. My mother was a lot smaller than I am. She said, "I don't want you to be too disappointed. It's very small. I'm sure it's not going to fit you." I took the ring right out of the box and slid it right onto my finger, and it fit perfectly. And it just always felt very special to me that the ring was found, and it's an interesting story. And if I wasn't somebody who loved stories and didn't visit my grandparents a lot, somebody would have come across this ring. It's like old photographs when people don't mark the backs or you don't share information about people, all is lost. To me, it's the stories behind the items, behind the photos, behind the people that make life interesting and make our community rich. And that's just one of many of those kinds of stories that I was told. I'd like to mention that this book that I produced for my family was written in 1 month's time in April of 2018. I created this first as an email letter that went out every day for National Poetry Month to my family. And each day I sent a cover letter about the family. I sent photos, and I sent poems related to this. And I hung on to all of those, and then later compiled this as this book, hard copy book. And then later in 2023, I produced a full exhibit for the community room at Palmer Public Library telling this story. And I had very large photos printed on canvas, sewed them to larger pieces of canvas, displayed them as panels, and a lot of people in the community enjoyed reading the story and finding out more about life for Franco-American families in Three Rivers during the 30s, 40s, 50s. I opened up on April 1st, 2018 with a story of how my dad almost drowned in 1935 when he was 4 years old. The poem is this. It's a short poem. It's about my grandfather who did not know how to swim. And he and his family and friends were at the Swift River. They were having a picnic one Sunday afternoon, and everyone was swinging from a rope swing from a tree across the river. And at one point, my grandfather was doing it. People were, not to get rope burn, they were wrapping rags around their hands, and they were hanging onto the rope. My grandfather was doing it, and someone suggested that he give his son a ride. His son, my father, who was 4. Here's the poem. At the picnic, Swift River, 1935. Pa took his turns, swinging above the current, landing dry each time beside the sycamore. Not like the swimmers who'd lift off to let drop. "Give the boy a ride," I heard an uncle say. Pa swooped me up, and we were on our way. The rope held, but his hand slipped. We sank, quick. Later, they'd say no one chanced rescuing us alone. What with Pa solid as the blocks of ice he delivered. Arms linked over arms, their human chain grew till they saved us. 2 things I remember. My mother's cries, and when they set me safe to shore. Nothing else is clear. I was only 4. My dad never learned to swim because of that episode. He was terrified to put his face in water. I'll never forget that. He put in an in-ground pool in our backyard. We all loved swimming. And to watch him trying to swim was very sad scene. He just never overcame that. He tried and tried and tried. So thankfully, all of that family thought very quickly and made that human chain and saved their lives. But it was a terrible, terrible day for my grandparents and my dad. Right somewhere in the middle of this book, I have to share this. I have a very, very sad, old, vintage, fabulous, loving, worn, delightful Santa mask here. This Santa costume goes back to the 1930s, maybe earlier. I'm not sure. I just know that my grandfather wore it all throughout Three Rivers. Why is it purple? Because it's faded. It's worn. It's threadbare. You can barely touch this thing without it wanting to fall apart. The pants are all ripped in the back. They have been patched with red. That new red didn't fade, but all the old red faded to purple. So here's how the story goes, and I address this in the book. So this mask and this suit were still being used in the 50s by my grandfather at our Christmas Eves. And it was getting pretty sad then, but it was still being used in the 70s when I had children and my brother and sister had children. And I still remember the look of terror on some of their faces because it was not a pretty picture. It was really kind of scary. But at that point, it was being worn by my brother because we all thought it was so hilarious at that point because it's a pretty fun story. But my grandfather told how in the 30s, he would walk the streets of Three Rivers on Christmas Eve, and he would stop into lots of French family homes for a shot. And he told them that if he didn't eat pickles when he had his shot, he would end up being sick. So people always served him pickles and booze, little shot, and off he'd go. Well, he got sick every single year with that tradition. And so that story, I have a little poem about that. I'm not going to read it, but that's one of my favorite stories. That's the kind of guy my grandfather was, and he always teased people. I started these stories on April 1st, 2018. That first day, there was a story about my grandfather. I honestly didn't know where this would go. I gave myself 30 days. Every day I took care of a whole entry. And I was surprised myself when I came full circle and the book and the stories ended again with my grandfather. So the ending of this, I've got a couple of pages here that I'll share with you. One of them is a story of how my father liked to go backpacking. And he did that through most of my growing up years, taught me to love backpacking, love the woods. It's in our blood. And I think we inherited that from my grandfather. At one point, my grandfather, RJ, went backpacking with my dad, just the two of them in the Adirondacks in New York. And when they came home that weekend, my father had this whittled stick, which I still have in my laundry room at home. And he had formed sort of a little spatula at the end. And he made it because they were cooking eggs out in the woods. And yeah, my father packed eggs. And he needed a little spatula, so he created one. And I kept the stick and wrote this poem. And I value this stick. The stick. His father was a lumberjack whose uncles headed for the woods, never to be heard from again. He healed a young maple planted by my dad. I spied him from the crack in our fern print drapes, mashing the medicine, massaging in poultice with glorious goo blackened hands, pausing tenderly on bended knee before wrapping burlap around the thirsty trunk. I first saw the stick as it fell from my father's pack, a feather in his 40 pounds of cookware, rain gear, food scraps, and such, after a weekend jaunt with his dad through the woods. It was nothing more than a debarked branch, whittled by my grandfather into a primitive cook tool, a long rounded handle with the other end slightly curved before going flat. I didn't see the stick again for more than 30 years, until the day my dad's gear was left abandoned on my porch, a bittersweet gift from a man whose lungs were finally forced off the trails. Christmas came early that day in July. There was a 2-man tent and a winter bag with lofts so high they don't make them like this anymore, whiskey flask, candle lantern, and a titanium cook rack with its own canvas sack, weighing no more, I swear, than an ounce. And hidden underneath it all, the stick he'd kept all those years. Now, on the edge of my whitewasher, it rests. One world meets the next. Spatula transformed to whisk, perpetually powered by my hand, dissolving detergent load after load after load. To you, it is a whittled nothing, a mere twig. One that you might toss to the edge of the road, or worse, burn on a springtime Saturday. To me, it is my inheritance, the golden stake in this garden. I'm twine tied to it, strong and straight, face lifted to the sun, sap burning through my veins. It gets a little emotional. A lot of great memories here. I'm going to end with my last 2 entries. April 30th, 2018. I sent this to my family. And April 29th, and April 30th. And as I told my family, this wasn't the end of the stories. It wasn't the end of the pictures. It wasn't the end of the poems, but it was time to end the project. And I felt satisfied with having shared at least the bulk of what I knew with people coming after me. So my grandfather smoked his whole life. He worked in the asbestos mines at the Tedford Mines in Canada, and he smoked a corncob pipe and Mayo's tobacco. He would sit on this little rocker in their kitchen right near the steam radiator every single night after dinner and have a smoke. And every single year for Christmas, I would walk down from Pine Street in Three Rivers near St. Anne's Church. I would walk to Four Corners gas station, the old gas station which no longer exists. They had a big wooden sign that said on the hill, but on the level, for people my age who remember that. And they sold corncob pipes and Mayo's tobacco in pouches. And I always bought that for him for Christmas. And I always walked to the other end of Three Rivers to downtown to Woodjack's, which was a retail clothing store. And I bought a pair of nylon stockings for my grandmother. So here's a poem about my grandfather's final days and what he had to say, and how I felt a certain guilt later on in life and wondered, how many of those pouches of Mayo tobacco did I contribute toward his emphysema, which I know pleasured him tremendously when he was smoking them, but I watched him suffer at the end. Here's the poem, And So I Don't. It wasn't delivered like a sermon. It was advice, a hospital bed whisper, 14 days and counting to a death that grew from seeds spread in his early teens, sent so young to work the mines, asbestos spiders spinning webs of rot across the lining of his lungs. I warmed and watered that rot, walking the annual December mile to Four Corners gas station, on the hill but on the level, buying him a new corncob pipe and a small pouch of Mayo's tobacco, paying homage to his lifelong vice, the only time he'd stop and sit. I liked the smell, and besides, it was a pact between us, this ritual Christmas gift. In burdened breath, with his unspoken list of regrets laid open like his Johnny, he offered these final words. Don't wait, he said. Don't. So that was shared with my family on April 29th. And now I'll share the last entry, which is about R.J. Fontaine, my grandfather, when he passed away. And I have a poem for that because every day of his life that I knew of, my grandfather's fingernails were dirty. Not because he was dirty. He was a very clean man. I mean, he cleaned up really nicely. He always wore a suit to church on Sundays, and he owned a rosary, and I have poems in here about that. But when you work on trucks and you work on mechanical things and you're always in grease and dirt, it's impossible to have clean fingernails. You can't do it. If you work 6 days a week like that, you can try if you want, but they never get clean. And that was normal. That was perfect. That was all I ever saw was my grandfather with a little bit of dirt, that dirt right way under his fingernails. So when he was laid out at his wake, I hated that someone had cleaned his fingernails. To this day, it was wrong. They shouldn't have done that. That's how I felt. So I wrote a poem about it because poetry for me is a way to assimilate pretty much everything. And I suggest it for people if you're looking for inexpensive therapy, if you're looking for a way to record a magical moment, something that makes you really happy, sad, overwhelmed, angry, joyful, try poetry. Here's the poem about my grandfather when he passed away and he was laid out. The way I like them. The day he was laid out, my grandfather's fingernails were clean. His black suit and stiff white shirt with the no-button collar and the shy gray tie were the same ones he'd worn to St. Anne's every Sunday, worn to all our family weddings and funerals. The hair was right, so little of it left, straight, coarse, slicked back, still black, but the fingernails were wrong. Wrong for a man whose hobby was to raise Black Angus cows, repair fence posts, grease his Massey Ferguson engine. Wrong for a man who changed tires on hundreds of trucks while hauling ice, then later hauling households. Wrong for a man whose wife used less oil on a washboard with a scrub brush in the basement, erasing sweat stains from his Sears work shirts. Leave his hands alone, I wished I'd said. Keep his nails dirty. And that concludes some of my stories. Thanks for listening.
This has been another recording of Palmer Village's Palmer Voices, brought to you by the Palmer Public Library in collaboration with the Leo S. Walsh Foundation, MPAC TV, Palmer Historical and Cultural Center, Palmer Historical Commission, Palmer Cultural Council, Mass Cultural Council, and Elbow Plantation Historical Society. To become a part of tomorrow's History Today, contact the Palmer Public Library to share your Palmer story. If you know someone whose story should be preserved, we'd love to hear about it. For more information, visit our website at palmerlibrary.org/palmervoices.